My name is Chris Norris. I'm the Product Manager, Industrial and Energy Products here at Tuftsud UK, based in the Machinery Division. I've worked in the machinery compliance sector for over 20 years and have been part of the Tuftsud Group for the last 10. Our presenter for today is Richard Brooks, who's the Technical Trainer for the Machinery Safety Division in Tuftsud UK. Richard has over 25 years of experience in the subject of machinery safety, starting with over a decade as a duty holder as a machine designer, responsible for complying with the legal requirements. Following that, he moved into a consultancy role, again specialising in machinery safety over the last 15 years. So I'll hand things over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for that introduction. Okay, so welcome everybody, and thanks for joining the webinar today. As you can appreciate, it's on UKCA marking with a specific reference to machinery. Just to note that we have provided other webinars in the past with a larger span of subject matter that applies to other types of product, not just machinery, but I'll be concentrating on machinery because I'm an engineer and I work for the Machinery Safety Division in Tuftsud. Okay, so even though I'll be concentrating on machinery, a lot of the principles that we'll be discussing will be equally as applicable to a lot of other types of products. Right, you've got an image in front of you, and obviously, as the image implies, this subject actually reflects the UK's history of being a member of the EU. And when I use the term EU, you know, that history is associated with CE marking, and the term EU, European Union, I'm going to be using it to include the European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Association countries, but I'll just use the term EU for brevity sake. So yes, this topic about UKCA marking, I think hopefully it should be fairly simple for most duty holders. However, that said, there's a whole lot of detail that needs to be considered as well, and we'll be touching on some of that detail, but not necessarily touching on everything. As Chris mentioned, there's questions and answers at the end of the session, so we might be able to answer specific questions. Right, so just as an introduction, you're all probably here because you've heard about UKCA marking and you're aware that it's looming on the horizon, but for those with you know, only a superficial understanding of what it is, basically it's a new UK marking that will be applied to certain goods, including machinery, that are placed on the market in Great Britain. Now, I'm using the term Great Britain because a lot of the laws actually differentiate between the UK and Great Britain, you know, being England, Scotland and Wales, and so that's why I use it. I've tried to use it consistently throughout wherever I'm in Great Britain as opposed to the UK. I've mentioned there were certain goods, and in actual fact there are about 25 different product groups, of which machinery is one. So yes, we'll be concentrating on machinery, but as I mentioned, there's the other product groups. And then I've asterisked the word machinery, because I'll be using that according to the definition provided in the regulations, as opposed to the kind of definition provided in in an English dictionary. We'll be having a look at what constitutes machinery under those definitions briefly later in the webinar. So another important aspect about UKCA marking is that it replaces CE marking in Great Britain. The situation is going to be slightly different as far as we can tell at the moment for Northern Ireland, and I will mention this later on. Now, CE marking is a well-established concept, and no doubt you will have seen the CE mark on many goods. Well, as a result of Brexit, this will be changing to the UKCA mark as things currently stand, and obviously all this is happening because of Brexit. And possibly the reason why many of you are sitting on the webinar is because one of the key dates in that change, in the change of the regulations, is the 1st of January next year, because the end of the implementation period is at the end of this year. Okay. Right. So why the change? Well, the change in the mark actually is a cherry on top of the cake. You know, the change is occurring in the regulations, and the actual mark is merely an indication by the manufacturer that the product or machinery satisfies the applicable regulations. Now, with the CE marking, CE marking occurred as a result of directives that were issued by the European Union, and had to be implemented into the member state law by the member states legislation, and in the case of the UK, this was done via regulations. Those regulations are still in place, but they need to be updated to reflect the consequences of Brexit. And so why do we need to update them? Because it's not as though we're going to, for example, allow unsafe machinery into the marketplace post this transition period. Of course we're not. The reason why they're changing is for, well, there are several reasons. One of the main ones is that the existing regulations concerning CE marking in the UK had many references to European processes and European regulations, and obviously due to Brexit we can't maintain that connection with Europe. I've mentioned the original CE marking regulations for machinery. They were the Supply of Machinery Safety Regulations 2008. But the other kind of fundamental reason why we can't just keep everything as it was is because if we continue to require CE marking and continue to refer to the European legislation, then we wouldn't be actually delivering, or the government wouldn't be delivering Brexit. And obviously we're committed to Brexit now. So the consequence of those changes means that for the continent of Europe, roughly speaking, there will now be two sets of regulatory requirements for manufacturers. Kind of one being the harmonised regulations across Europe regarding CE mark, and then the other being the UK specific regulations associated with the UKCA mark. So there's some of the general principles. Let's have a quick look at the time scales now, and because this is an important factor at the moment. Currently, we are in what is commonly referred to as a transition period, which ends on the 31st of December. And importantly, obviously anything's possible, it seems, in politics, but the period after which an extension is allowed to this transition period has expired. And so we've been kicking the can down the road for a long time with regards to Brexit. There is a brick wall at the end of that road currently, at the 31st of December. And I've mentioned Brexit several times. Brexit is actually in the past now. Brexit occurred at the end of January this year, and now we're in this transition period. It's actually formally referred to in the regulations as the implementation period, or shortened to IP, and that officially ends on the 11th. At 11 p.m. on the 31st of December this year, and that day is referred to as the IP completion day. So during the transition period and prior to the IP completion day, the CE marking requirements still apply in the UK, and so essentially there's no change to how it has been for the past nearly 30 years regarding CE mark. This webinar is primarily associated with what happens after that implementation period. And just to recap those timescales, as you can see, the diagram there shows that Brexit occurred on the 31st of January. The trade talks began on the 2nd of March, which seems to make the term implementation period a bit of a misnomer, because we should have been implementing the modifications rather than trying to agree on the modifications. But anyway, personal opinion. And then one of the key points was the deadline for the extension of the transition period or the implementation period, and that deadline passed on the 30th of June this year. So we now are not able, under the current legislation, to extend this period, so hence the kind of brick wall. And then, as I mentioned, 11 p.m. On the 31st is IP completion day, and then from the 1st of January next year, we'll either be in a hard Brexit situation with no trade deal, but as you're probably aware, the trade negotiations are really at the 11th hour and kind of 59th minute currently, and there is still no indication that we'll arrive at an agreement. But there's, never say never, as I say. Michael Barnier and Michel Barnier, should I say, and David Frost might pull something out the hat, but personally, I'd be surprised. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the legislation associated with this subject. So Brexit has required significant changes UK law. There has been decades of law created that is intertwined with the European Union. You know, that's made our legislation intertwined with the European Union's, and obviously that all that's got to be undone. Two of the main primary pieces of legislation, the acts, are the European Withdrawal Act 2018 and the Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020, and one of the principles that they established was that the kind of detailed changes in the regulations could be implemented by statutory instruments. Statutory instruments are pieces of legislation that largely get waived through Parliament, and those statutory instruments that have been associated with Brexit have been called EU exit statutory instruments, SIs, as I've got on the slides there, and there are over 600 of them. So there's a lot of statutory instruments, and some of those include the longest ever, in terms of number of pages, longest ever statutory instruments in the history of UK legislature. Perhaps at this point, the statutory instruments associated with this particular subject, UKCA marking, there's probably, I've not counted them specifically, I don't know, 10, 15, if that. And so, you know, the UKCA marking represents about 2% of you know, the total number of changes in legislation as a result of Brexit. And, you know, as I've indicated, there are several statutory instruments regarding transitioning to the UKCA mark. Okay. One of the key points about these statutory instruments are that they don't kind of remove the original regulations, so the supply of machinery safety regulations. Rather, they amend the original regulations, and not only that, due to the evolution of the Brexit arrangement agreements and the timescales, etc., we have subsequent statutory instruments that also amend the original regulations and indeed amend the amendments. Now, the consequence of that is that to actually read the statutory instruments and understand them is almost impossible. Whereas before it was possible to read the regulations and interpret them for the layperson, now we've got amendments and amendments of amendments over multiple pieces of legislation, which makes it quite difficult. It's almost impenetrable. That said, there is the main and original statutory instrument regarding UKCA marking, which is often referred to as a mega SI, should I say, and that was laid in 2019, number 696. All of these pieces of legislation are available from legislation.gov.uk. Okay. Some of the subsequent pieces of legislation from that correct the original, as I don't know if you can see here on the slide, but but up here it acknowledges this is actually a statutory instrument, which is, you know, a piece of legislation often referred to as regulations, but it acknowledges that it's correcting the original statutory instrument, and also they add things like modifying the dates of, you know, the completion day, and more recently they've made changes associated with northern specific requirements for Northern Ireland. Okay. And so this is just an example of one of those statutory instruments. Just as an aside, these statutory instruments, they don't get passed through parliaments as primary legislation. They kind of get waved through, and on the nod, there is an official method by which they can be queried and debated, but it's called kind of negative sifting, you know, by which they're only debated if somebody raises an issue with them, and there's a time period in which they can do that of about 40 days. So once these have been laid before Parliament, there's approximately 40 days after which they become enacted as law, and that enables you to pass a large amount of legislation without taking up an inordinate amount of parliamentary time. And so this one, for example, like most of these statutory instruments, they actually conclude with the fact that the UKCA marking requirements come into force on IP completion day. They have been laid, they are on the statute book, but they don't come into force until IP completion day. Indeed, and as well as that, as we'll see, there are certainly one and possibly more draft statutory instruments that haven't been laid before Parliament yet, and that will affect some aspects of UKCA marking. And so this is just this graphic is just a kind of representation of the situation for machinery. The original regulations were the supply of machinery safety regulations 2000. Oops, there's noticed a mistake on there. That says LVD, and that should say machinery directive. They implemented the machinery directive, and then there's the subsequent amendment of those regulations to reflect UKCA marking in SI number 696 in 2019, and then there has been numerous subsequent amendments in these other statutory instruments that do various things, and we know that there's one drafted, and the draft is available, but it's this bottom one. It's not been laid in front of it's not been laid yet. It's not gone through Parliament, and it acknowledges that there are actually recorrections. So I'm not just talking about correction; we're talking about recorrection. So from that, the main takeaway point is that the legislation is complicated now, and there's nothing we can do about that. Let's move on away from the legislation to kind of perhaps what might be considered as the history, but for UKCA marking, because essentially it's born out of European CE marking. So the CE mark is required again for certain products. Those 25 different types of products supplied in the EU, of which we were a member. Now, CE marking. Just bear with me a minute. indicates, as I mentioned, that the product meets the applicable requirements regarding a product's design, including machinery. And the whole concept originated with European directives, and the reason why Europe created those directives was to ensure free movement of goods throughout Europe. That's slightly different to the purpose of the regulations, because the purpose of the actual member states' regulations was actually to ensure that society worked effectively and people didn't have to be supplied with potentially dangerous machinery, for example. But the directives required the member states to implement the requirements of the directives into their own law, and hence you got that harmonisation of legislation throughout Europe with regards to supplying products. So that's what CE marking was in a nutshell. And there was a machinery directive that required CE marking, and the regulations therefore kind of copied and pasted the requirements of that directive into the UK regulations, and probably the majority of the requirements of those CE marking regulations are still applicable now, or will be still applicable next year under UKCA marking, including, for example, what the definition of machinery is. And so, as I said, the definition's contained in the directive, and typically it's things with powered moving parts, as opposed to kind of equipment that requires purely manual effort. And it can apply to industrial type machinery, and discrete machines, as well as complete, complicated mechanical systems. But it can also apply to more domestic type products. We've still got powered moving parts there, and mobile equipment would apply to cranes and trucks and things. And there are further categories of products in the machinery directive that also fall within the scope that actually don't have any powered moving parts, and we've got an example there of lifting slings, and there are several other similar sorts of categories. So it applies to a wide range of equipment, and that scope hasn't changed between CE marking and UKCA marking. So that's the type of equipment that we're looking at. What about the duty holders? Well, essentially, the requirements talk about manufacturers whose name is on the equipment, is named on the certification or the Declaration of Conformity, and identified on the instruction manual. And they're responsible for ensuring that the equipment satisfies the requirements under both sets of regulations, UKCA and CE marking. There's also a concept called authorised representative, who can adopt some or all of the responsibilities of the manufacturer, provided they've got a written mandate to do so. And typically they've got to exist on either European soil for CE marking or UK soil for UKCA marking. But the kind of entirety of the regulations also place responsibilities on other duty holders like importers and distributors, and we'll have a quick look at the implications for those shortly. So just to explain what the requirements are, and again, this applies to both sets of regulations. There are in the Machinery Directive, essential health and safety requirements, and they're associated with the design and the marking and the instructions. And then there's another set of requirements which I call attestation requirements, again applicable to all machinery and all products within the scope of the directive, and that is that it requires the equipment to be marked, either UK or either UKCA or CE Mark. It requires the manufacturer to provide a declaration and then to collate a technical file. And then there are requirements that are termed conformity assessment procedures. And for the Machinery Directive, there are 3 different types of these. So that assessment of conformity with internal checks is the most commonly applied one, because that applies to the vast majority of machinery. These other types only apply to a relatively small proportion of those machinery. Now, between UKCA and CE marking, there's no changes to, or essentially no changes to the essential health and safety requirements. It's those requirements that influence the design of the machine. So there are no changes to the design, whether it be CE marked or UKCA marked. So that's a great. It makes the manufacturer or the duty holders' lives simpler. However, the UKCA marking does have changes with regards to those other types of requirements. The mark, obviously, the declaration, technical file, and the conformity assessment procedures to some extent. And we'll have a look at those shortly. So to investigate some of those modifications, I'll be running through these couple of tables briefly. We've got the EU requirements in this column, the UK or terminology in this column, and a few notes about it, and you'll be able to have a look at these notes at leisure if you want to revisit the webinar. It's being recorded. So, key difference, the UK marking will be termed, and this is termed in the regulations, UK marking, but actually the mark that's also defined in the regulations says UKCA mark, and so most people are referred to it as a UKCA mark. I mentioned those conformity assessment procedures, some of which need the involvement of a notified body, bearing in mind that most machinery doesn't need the involvement of a notified body, and also bearing in mind that for CE marking, it's only ever the manufacturer or his authorised representative that actually declare compliance, and the notified body or approved body, in the case of UKCA marking, they don't certify the product, they contribute to those conformity assessment procedures. So there's a different term for those bodies under the UK regulations now. They're no longer called notified bodies, they're called UK approved bodies, and some of them are called, some of the amendments call them UK designated bodies, just to make things a bit more confusing. But anyway, now those UK approved bodies will be approved by the Secretary of State, and that's defined in the new regulations. In Europe, under the CE marking directives, there is a list of those notified bodies, or a database. People call it the NANDO database, not NANDOs. And that lists all the notified bodies throughout Europe. Obviously, we're no longer in Europe, and therefore there will be a UK-based list that, as far as I'm aware, has not been released yet. but there'll be a list of UK approved bodies. Just moving on to a couple of other differences. Under CE marking, there was reference to certain type of standard that provided a presumption of conformity with the requirements with the essential requirements that we saw earlier on, and they were referred to as harmonised standards. In the UK regulations, they're referred to as designated standards, and currently, as far as we're aware, those standards will remain exactly the same standards, apart from the fact that the designated standards will be BS, British standards, whereas the harmonised standards are EN. So actually the designated standards will typically be BSEN or BSEN ISO standards. But you'll be using and applying exactly the same standards to provide a presumption of conformity with the UKCA requirements. And again, in Europe, it was the European Union essentially, or the European Commission, should I say, that maintained a list of harmonised standards, and obviously we can't use that list now. And therefore we'll have our own list of designated standards. And again, that will be issued, I'm not sure by whom, probably by BASE, but it will be under the auspices of the Secretary of State. And then finally on this page, CE marking requires an EU Declaration of Conformity, or sometimes incorporation, for the Machinery Directive. The UK regulations also refer to a declaration of conformity, but I think commonly that will become referred to as the a UK declaration of conformity, to distinguish it from the EU declaration of conformity, because they'll be different. And we'll have a look at the differences between those declarations shortly. So to summarise, there's actually 4 columns here. I've talked about really so far 2, i.e., the CE marking requirements in the EU and the GB requirements, Great Britain requirements. There's this added complexity of the 4th column, which is equipment that's going to be supplied to Northern Ireland, which to some extent is still not yet it's not yet, it's drafted, but it's not yet been passed by Parliament. Now, so essentially, for Great Britain, the mark will be the UKCA mark. You'll have a UK Declaration of Conformity, and the technical file must be available by somebody in the UK, and likewise in the case of CE marking, it must be available via somebody in the EU, essentially. Perhaps just quickly mention the Northern Ireland situation. I've been told to steer clear of it yet because it's not yet finalised, and to tell you the truth, people don't quite understand it, 100%, me included. But as far as I'm aware, CE mark goods will still be legitimately be able to supplied in Northern Ireland, but the draft regulations identify this kind of third marking, the UKNI marking, which is defined in the draft regulations, and it will be possible, if these become enacted, for equipment manufactured in Northern Ireland to actually show both of these markings, but for goods supplied in Northern Ireland from outside, the CE marking requirements will be applicable. So as I say, that's a little bit up in the air at the moment. I mentioned declarations. So as per, aligned with CE marking, all machinery will need to be supplied with a declaration of a UK Declaration of Conformity, which will be much the same as the EU Declaration of Conformity, but whereas the EU declaration referred to the EU directives that would be applicable, the UK regulation will need to refer to the UK statutory instruments that will be applicable. This is not a difficult task. There's a kind of one-to-one relationship with most of these product groups and the directives and the relationship. And the regulations, and so that's quite easy to do. But then there's the added complexity of a whole long list of amendments to the original regulations, and also obviously the UK Declaration of Conformity will need to list the UK designated standards, i.e. will have to be a BS in front of them rather than just the EN standards. They'll be the same standards, but it'll be published by BSI rather than any other member state. Sometimes some types of product and some small proportion of machinery needs the involvement of an approved body. And those approved bodies will be UK based, and there won't be notified bodies. Reason being is that you can't have a notified body outside the European Union, and we are no longer a member of the European Union. So all the UK notified bodies, which were have become UK approved bodies. They've been ported straight over to being approved. So these slides kind of go through what the implications are for various situations. In this case, we've got a British manufacturer supplying to Great Britain. Key point, as I mentioned, no changes required to the design of the machinery. Certainly not after after the completion day. Whether there will be then divergence between the requirements of the UK and Europe remains to be seen. But initially there will be no differences in the essential requirements. But the manufacturer will need to apply the UKCA mark rather than the CE mark, and issue the UK Declaration of Conformity referring to the UK legislation. The technical file, because the manufacturer is in Britain, will be kept in Britain, and will essentially use the same standards as before, but they'll be known as designated standards. And in cases where a kind of a third-party approval is required under the regulations, it will be a UK approved body as opposed to a notified body previously under CE marking. So that's the situation for British manufacturers supplying into Britain. What about EU and rest of the world manufacturers, for that matter, supplying into Great Britain? Again, no changes to the machinery design from CE marking. In fact, everything's pretty much the same as the previous slide. However, on the declaration, they'll need to refer to a UK entry point, point of contact. A UK entity as the contact point for the technical file. But the technical file won't actually need to reside on UK soil, just as the technical file doesn't need to reside on European soil for CE marking. But everything else will be pretty much the same. Again, they will have to use a UK approved body if needed by the regulations for certain types of machinery, as opposed to and that UK approved body will reside in the UK. They won't be able to use a notified body. What about now British manufacturers supplying into Europe? Well, they'll essentially need to do exactly the same as they did before Brexit. All the no changes to the design, EU Declaration of Conformity, CE Mark. In this case, the technical file will probably be held in Britain. But the key thing is that the manufacturer will no longer be in the EU, whereas before we were in the EU. And therefore, that has implications regarding whoever it's going to or via in Europe. Because when we were in the UK, in the EU, when we were a manufacturer, the entity in Europe, or on the other in the other member state, was actually acting as a distributor. And remember, these entities do have obligations under some of the regulations. But now, what was a distributor will become actually an EU importer, and they have different obligations to a distributor. I suppose the main one is that the importer, in addition to the obligations of a distributor, needs to ensure that the appropriate conformity assessment procedures required by the CE marking directives and regulations have been satisfied, and that might mean confirming, for example, that there's a technical file available, which is not an obligation as a distributor. So there will be changes to the obligations within Europe, and kind of the same happens the other way around for European manufacturers selling goods into the UK. What was a distributor would now essentially be an importer under the UKCA marking requirements. And there'll need to be a an EU entity identified on the declaration as a point of contact for the technical file. And of course, you'll need to use an EU notified body, of which there are none in the UK now because we're not on EU soil. So there are a few considerations. I've mentioned distributors and importers. So yeah, I think I've gone through that top point. There will be a lot of people as a result of this process that move from being a distributor, either in Europe or the UK, to an importer, and that will then therefore place additional obligations on them. And for just as a kind of an aside, that in Europe those obligations will be strengthened under future directives that are due for coming into force next July, I think. Anyway, so and likewise, the same happens between European manufacturers and UK importers, and of course this all comes to force at the beginning of next year. So yeah, the importers have the additional obligation of ensuring that appropriate conformity assessment procedures have been followed. So one of the questions that we often get asked is, can we apply the UKCA mark now? According to a statement from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the answer to that is yes, and indeed some people are already doing that now. Neither the CE marking requirements or the UKCA marking requirements prevent the use of other types of marking, providing they can't be confused with the CE mark or the UKCA mark. So there's no problem with doing that. now in preparation for the actual change next year. I've briefly mentioned this already. I'm going to have to read up a little bit. I've briefly mentioned this already, and that is both type examination certificates and declarations of conformity might become a little bit complicated as a result of the large number of statutory instrument amendments, and the question still to be answered, you know, what should be referred to on those what are actually legal documents. You know, is it acceptable to refer to the original statutory instrument alone because it's been amended by all of these, some of which haven't been actually issued yet, or can we just refer to the original and then as amended? Because there's a long list of these, and some of the titles of them are quite lengthy, as you can see. We don't know the answer to that, and it might require a legal kind of opinion on the acceptability of you know, the short form reference to the original regulations. I've mentioned the Mega SI. The Mega SI does amend the machinery directive, the machinery regulations. It also amends most of the other what were originally CE marking regulations, and bearing in mind machinery often falls within the scope of the EMC directive, the EMC requirements, restriction of hazardous substances, pressure equipment, noise of outdoor equipment, and there are different schedules within that Mega SI to deal with all of those regulations. And so it's not just a case of dropping into one statutory instrument to have a look at the requirements for, say, machinery. You know, these are big documents covering a lot of you know, a lot of issues. Approved standards. Quick note on approved standards. Currently, the standards aren't expected to change. BSI is still going to participate in the production of European standards and feeding into European harmonisation, and they will be published in the UK. So very little is expected to change with the standards in the short term, and the relationship between, you know, the list of designated standards in the UK and the UKCA marking regulations will be the same as it is for CE marking, in that they will provide a presumption of conformity, you know, once deemed to do so by the Secretary of State. Again, no, nothing's been issued formally with regards to that. And then we're getting towards the end here. A quick note on guidance. So there's two types of guidance. One, guidance regarding the transition between CE marking and UKCA marking. That's available from the UK gov.uk website, and so there's a couple of important pages there. But another potentially important source is this one. So for each of those EU exit SIs, there is generally an explanatory memorandum which explains the statutory instruments, which, believe me, is required if you try and read them. But again, they cover lots of regulations, and they're only amending regulations, and so they're quite difficult to interpret without cross-referencing and, you know, multiple cross-references. The UK government did release some UK marking guidance on the gov.uk website just here, but it was withdrawn. It's still there, but it says it's withdrawn on it because it didn't reflect the current situation. And the update to that guidance has yet to be made, probably due to delays associated with COVID and changes in the agreement, etc. Now, the other source of guidance is the UK is guidance actually on the detail of requirements. Previously, for CE marking machinery, there was a big, thick guide, 460 pages long, but that was issued by the European Commission. There is no equivalent UK document to cover UKCA marking, so it's not applicable. However, a lot of this document was associated with the technical essential health and safety requirements, which have not been changed, and so that will still remain useful, but not strictly valid. And likewise, there was the European Commission's Blue Guide associated with the general principles of CE marking, 156 pages long. And again, no UK equivalent as yet. Hopefully there will be movement on that, but I shouldn't hold your breath. And then just a couple of other points to note. So just to confirm, CE Mark machinery and products can still be supplied in the UK currently during the implementation period, and the most recent draft of the statutory instrument that's expected to be passed before Parliament mentions that there's a 12-month sunset provision to enable legitimately CE marked equipment to continue to be supplied all through next year. Again, this is draft, it's not enforced yet. However, it is reflected in the guidance, so the guidance on the government website, and so the guidance is preceding the regulations there. And there's also, and again, this is draft, there's this 24-month period, essentially, during which you can affix a sticker, if you like, a UKCA marking sticker, or yes, it needs to be permanently affixed, but it doesn't need to be, I forget what the wording is, it doesn't need to be the same permanent requirements associated with the identification of the manufacturer and the identity of the product. But you can only apply that UKCA marking sticker, if you like, for a period of 20 months, after which it'll be exactly the same requirements as the current requirement for CE marking. What will happen next? Well, trade agreement, Lord knows what will happen. It might change everything. It's getting very late in the day to expect that change. There are very limited timescales before the completion day. Enforcement after the completion day, if manufacturers and suppliers don't comply with these regulations, is unlikely to be very high on people's agendas. There will probably be further statutory instruments correcting the complicated statutory instruments arrived at to date, and hopefully there will be detailed and authoritative guidance from the authorities regarding UKCA marking.